Judie Oron is a journalist, lecturer, and award-winning author who was born in Montreal, moved to Israel in 1967 following the Six-Day War, and returned to Canada in 2004. Judie's articles have appeared, among others, in the Jerusalem Post, Lifestyles magazine, the Canadian Jewish News, Australian Christian Women, Weekly Press Pakistan, the Jerusalem Report, and Baycrest Foundation publications. Her award-winning novel, Cry of the Giraffe, is based on the true story of her daughter Waditu's experience as a slave in Ethiopia, and tells the story in Waditu's voice. The novel has been republished in English in several countries in the Indian subcontinent and is now available in Hebrew. Judie studied anthropology at McGill University and African Studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She worked as a feature writer at the Jerusalem Post, including a 4-year stint as a weekly columnist. From 1984 to 86, Judie acted as the director of the Jerusalem Post 3 charitable funds. After the exposure of the secret airlifts of Ethiopian Jews from Sudan to Israel, Operation Moses, Judie opened a 4th fund, Operation Homecoming, for the immigrants who were arriving in the country with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And Judie left the Jerusalem Post to organize and direct a group of concerned professionals that assisted Ethiopian Jews to find their way to Israel. Actually, I should point out there's a poster at the back there of some of those refugees, and you should go see it. It really debunks the myth of apartheid. This was the beginning for Judie of a 25-year association with the community that involved lengthy visits to Ethiopia, extensive work with the community in Israel, including the organization and overseeing of Project Wellness, a mobile ophthalmology unit for Ethiopians affected by eye diseases, assisting in fundraising and coordinating the building of a Beta Israel synagogue in the city of Lod, and participation on the Ethiopian Jewish Education Committee in the city of Lod. Judie took into her family and raised 2 Ethiopian Jewish sisters, one of whom she came across in Addis Ababa. Upon learning that another sister was missing, she went alone to war-ravaged Ethiopia to find and release her from slavery. You know, sometimes we like to ask, whether you're religious or not, I just happen to be, some people want to ask why God. They ask God why there's so much evil in the world. But every once in a while you meet someone who proves that the right question to ask is, why is there so much good in the world? And people like Judie Oron make you realize that is the real miracle of our existence. And when we spoke, Judie and I referred to as a humanitarian. Seemed obvious to me. But she was really taken aback by that, and she said to me, believe it or not, no one called her that. They mostly accused her of being a liar or crazy. I'm sure you will agree with me that the word humanitarian doesn't begin to do her justice. And please welcome Judie Oron.
First of all, gosh, Mark, thank you for that incredible introduction. I'm still a bit abashed by the idea of humanitarian. Maybe we could just delete that. I'm really happy to be here. As Mark said, I'm a Canadian-Israeli journalist. And I've lived most of my life in Israel. It's great to be there, and it's great to be back in Canada. I'd like to start by showing you a photo I shot in Ethiopia more than 20 years ago. It shows a Jewish child, a former slave named Waditu, as Mark told you, who's now a member of my family. And if we can have the next slide. Okay, so that's my brood. One of the pluses of being able to do this is that you get to schwitz about your children. So, in her language, Amharic, Waditu's name means little treasure. It's not the kind of name you would have expected to find from a family that doesn't really care much about its kid. It says a lot about how that family felt about this child. She was a cheerful, pretty child. Some even called her beautiful. She had a strong desire to be helpful. But what was really special about her was her much-envied, long, elegant neck. Her fellow villagers used to watch her as she strode confidently back and forth through the village, gathering water. Sometimes the children in the village would call out to one another, "There goes that girl, you know, the one with the neck of a giraffe." No one watched over her more keenly than Barry Hoon, her own father. But even so, all his watchfulness couldn't prevent Woditu, aged 13, and her sister Laute, aged 10, from being violently torn from their family in a refugee camp in Sudan, alone on a long, forced march back to Ethiopia. The two sisters struggled to survive, not knowing that much harder times were to come. Can we have the next slide, please? Cry of the Giraffe tells a story that I was pretty sure I'd never be able to tell. It's a story that our family kept secret for 2 decades. The book is written in Woditu's voice, that of an Ethiopian Jewish child who in the late 1980s trekked with her family to Sudan, hoping to get to Israel in the wake of a secret airlift codenamed Operation Moses. Instead, she was separated from her family, then later from her sister, and over time endured starvation, abuse, enforced prostitution, and ultimately slavery. Almost from the moment I found Woditu and paid for her freedom, I was aware as a journalist that that was a pretty big story. But then love came into it, and as you know, that always messes things up. I'd already taken the girl's younger sister, Laute, into our family, and it didn't take long before Woditu became part of us too. She was enormously scarred, and she was ill. But she was also hugely charming and, oddly enough, quite the little comedian. So she very quickly captured our hearts and made us her defenders. But defending Woditu meant keeping her secrets. We were quite worried about what would happen if her experience as a slave were exposed. So we kept her secrets, and I got on with the process of becoming her mother. And then 4 years ago, she asked me to tell her story. I was shocked, and the whole family was shocked. And at first, I tried to persuade her not to go public. But after listening to her reasons, I finally agreed. Telling her story was Woditu's way of showing what it's like for the thousands of children trafficked and trapped into modern-day slavery in Ethiopia. And more than anything, Woditu wanted to bring attention to what she calls a feel good about Israel story. That is, our country's rescue of her people. 2 arguments finally clinched it for me. The first was Woditu's comment, and I think it's quite telling considering where we're standing, or where I'm standing and you're sitting today. Her comment was, "Oi, Ima," Mom, for heaven's sake, if women hadn't been willing to tell their stories after the Holocaust, how would we ever have known what really happened then? The second was my son Yonatan's comment, "My sister is a hero. I want everyone to know it." All right, we have another slide coming up. Thanks. Oh no, you've skipped one, I think. Oh. Really? Fouled again. Okay. No, not yet. All right, so we just missed a slide of Woditu and Daniel at the launch of Cry of the Giraffe. Sorry about that. Since the book launch in 2010, Cry of the Giraffe has gone pretty much around the world. telling Woditu's story. As an Israeli, I'm always proud to point out that these secret rescue operations represent the only time in human history that a first world nation took a large black community out of Africa, not in order to enslave it or exploit it, but in order to set them free. I personally always get goosebumps when I say that sentence. Operations Moses and Solomon are a tribute to the courageous Israelis who went into enemy territory to rescue these starving and destitute Jews. It's especially a tribute to the brave Ethiopians who followed their dream, knowing full well that many of them would die, either on the long and perilous trek to Sudan or in the disease-infested refugee camps while waiting sometimes months and sometimes years to be rescued. On February 21st, 1992, I became part of a privileged group of people who have redeemed a human being from slavery. The act of purchasing a Jewish slave sparked anger and a terrifying mob attack on the two of us, such that we escaped quite literally because at that particular moment there was a wind. Even after all these years, this experience still feels unreal to me. And there are moments, especially during the nighttime hours, when I can still feel that mob rocking our car in an attempt to overturn it and get at the two hated Jews, one white and one black, who were cowering inside. But luck was on our side that day, big time. And in the 22 years that have passed since then, I've been so lucky to call this extraordinary woman daughter and to watch her heal and flourish in Israel. I think now we have the next slide. Yeah, a slight difference, I believe. Nothing like a few cosmetics and Israeli air. I came to be in the middle of this story through my work, as Mark told you. I was born in Montreal. I moved to Israel in 1967, and from 1972 I worked as a journalist for the Jerusalem Post newspaper. In 1985, just as Operation Moses was being exposed in the press, I was appointed director of the newspaper's 3 charitable funds, and realizing that destitute Ethiopians were coming from Sudan with nothing but the clothes on their back, I opened a 4th fund at the newspaper to purchase things for them. Not too long after that, I became convinced that the community urgently needed another kind of help. So I left the newspaper and formed a small, unlisted group of friends and professionals that tried to assist Ethiopian Jewish families whose relatives had still not made it to Israel. We raised money, we sent family members to Ethiopia to look for their missing relatives, and when there was no family member able to go, one of us went instead. We have another slide. That's the one that was missing. That's me crying in the corner as Daniel and Woditu were launching the book. So we have one more next. Okay. So I was in Ethiopia in 1990 when I was asked by an Israeli embassy official to look after a little girl named Laute. I hope you can all see the twinkle in her eye. She's quite a little scamp. It wasn't clear how this adorable child had come to be alone in the middle of a war zone. I was told that she'd become separated from her family in Sudan and that the rest of her family had been airlifted to Israel. We're waiting very anxiously to be reunited with her. So Laute became my little shadow. She kind of attached herself to my hip. And during the 2 months that it took for her to receive her Ethiopian exit papers, we became very close. When I got back to Israel a few weeks later, I went to visit Laute in the north of Israel. We have another slide. Thanks. Her father, Berihun, told me that another child was still missing. He was too ill to go and look for her himself, so he paid a man to go. The man returned, saying that Woditu had died. Berihun feared that he himself was dying, so he asked me to take Laute into my family, which we did. We have another one now. Berihun and his family sat Shiva, mourned for Waditu for 7 days. And for 2 years, as Laute was growing up in my family, I never asked the child about her deceased sister. I just was really trying very hard not to hurt her feelings in any way. One night at 3 a.m., I woke up and I found Laute sitting on her bed, crying quite badly, and writing a letter to Waditu. When I asked her why in the world she was doing that, she looked at me and she said, "My sister can't be dead. I can still feel her breathing." Literally in those words. So in 1992, I went back to Ethiopia to look for the missing and presumed dead sister of a child that I had come to love. Setting out, I didn't really believe that I would manage to track Waditu down. Finding a child slave in Ethiopia is not difficult because there are many of them in that country. But finding a specific child slave is not so simple. Still, sometimes you get lucky. And Waditu and I had an enormous amount of luck on our side that day. Today there are approximately 130,000 Ethiopian Jews living in Israel. We recently marked the 30th anniversary of Operation Moses, a highly dangerous airlift of Ethiopian Jews from Sudan, a country that is a dedicated enemy of Israel, and where it's illegal even for Jews or Israelis to land. We have a slide. And in May of this year, we'll be celebrating the 23rd anniversary of Operation Solomon, the last-ditch airlift of over 14,000 Ethiopian Jews from Addis Ababa to Israel, just hours before a rebel army was about to impose a violent regime change upon that country. One more slide. I was fortunate to be one of the many people conscripted for Operation Solomon. One of my first assigned tasks was to do medical evacuation of the sick and wounded, and I can tell you, there were many on those airplanes who would not have survived much longer if they hadn't been airlifted over that really dramatic weekend in May. Many of those new immigrants were children, and I stole every moment I could to run down to the dining hall to watch their glee over things that we take so much for granted, things as innocuous to us as a drinking straw or a pair of sunglasses. We have 2 more slides. Aren't they amazing? And I love that one in particular. The kids were polite about the strange food, but hungry though they were, most of their plates and their stomachs remained empty as they contemplated such unheard-of items as defrosted breaded schnitzel and, of all things, store-bought cake. A few minutes later, after this particular visit, I got an urgent call to use my basic Amharic to clear the children out of the elevators. The kids had figured out how to make the elevators go up and down, and none of the adults could get anywhere in this multi-story building. And that reminds me of another elevator story told here in Toronto last year by an Ethiopian Jewish rabbi, Harav Shalom Sharon. He was in that same building as Operation Solomon was winding down, and he spied an old man standing in front of that same elevator. The doors closed, and as he was frantically trying to figure out how to rescue the disappearing lady, the doors opened again and a much younger woman got out. You see where I'm going with this, right? The old man made a beeline for his wife, convinced that if he could just find a way to shove her into that magic box, it would no doubt send forth a much younger wife. There is logic to that. Elevators aside, people often ask me what in the world made me go to war-torn Ethiopia to look for Waditu. You may also be wondering what connection my personal story has with our topic today, telling the truth about Israel. To me, the connection is so very clear. I went to search for Woditu and took her and Laute into my family because after living most of my life in Israel, I was strongly influenced by the Israel that I know and love, the Israel that I characterize as a rescuing nation. So many of Israel's rescue missions fill the history books, the airlifts of Ethiopian Jews, the Entebbe rescue. They're just some of the more famous ones. I won't go into the other ones because Iris has done it so beautifully when talking about Magen David Adom. My personal experience of Israelis is that they can sometimes be slightly overbearing, but they are also a very warm and inclusive people. As a young girl, I was sent to a kibbutz in the Jezreel Valley. On my very first day, I was tractored out to an orchard and soon found myself precariously perched on a ladder, attempting to pick olives. More like attempting not to fall off the ladder. A kibbutznik named Ziona, Zichrona Levracha, Ziona died 2 years ago, unfortunately, was perched on a ladder on the other side of the tree, and she inquired whether I had any family in Israel. When I said no, I immediately acquired a new mother and father and 4 siblings who, still today, treat me as a slightly incompetent but lovable, quote, new immigrant who must forever be lovingly coaxed to follow the right paths in life. Since most Israelis know everything much better than I do, I generally allow them to lead the way. This has worked out pretty well for me so far. The adoption system, a way of mentoring and including newcomers, began just after World War II, when devastated Jews were pouring into Israel after the Holocaust. It was that record of rescue and inclusion that inspired me to go to Ethiopia to look for Woditu and to take her and Laute into my family. I was following Israeli cultural traditions that I had witnessed over almost 4 decades. Now, I'm not a strategist or a political thinker, so I'll leave the discussions about land rights and such to my learned colleagues who are going to follow me. I'm a writer, and I'm told that dreaming is one of my dubious talents. So in my fantasies, I conjure up a world in which events like Israeli Apartheid Week have fallen by the wayside. I can then hope that Jewish and Israeli students will be able to stride peacefully through the world's campuses, and writers like me can go back to our computers and describe the characters and events that so far exist only in our heads. Oh, and I've got one last thing I absolutely have to tell you. I recently had the enormous pleasure of becoming a completely besotted grandmother to Woditu's firstborn child. Thank you so much. Please don't take a photograph of that if you can possibly not. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing my story and Woditu's.